All right, are you ready to jump in? Yeah. So innovation is omnipresent in modern life. It's a key feature, in fact, of modern life, so much so that people largely take it for granted. They think it just naturally occurs, like leaves on trees. But from starting in the 19th century, the railroads, what Edison called the phonograph, we now call the record player. That's what's there in the middle. The airplane, Bell's invention of the telephone and the light bulb, and of course electricity generators, massive generators powering electrical grids, and then up to the 20th century, right? And the antibiotics that came with the pharmaceutical revolution of the early 20th century, and then the computers that came to define the revolutions of the last half of the 20th century, and then the smartphones and mobile revolution of the turn of the 20th century. It's great being as old as I am that I can now refer to the turn of the century as what happened just 21 years ago, as opposed to what happened 120 years ago is what we used to refer to it. And of course, and the thing that we are all now benefiting from, the mRNA vaccines, and other types of biotech revolutions, and self-driving cars. So the world is incredible, filled with innovation. And when we think of innovation, we often think of the things that I just listed off in the pictures that you've seen on my slides. We think of the inventions. So historically, you think of Samuel Morse's invention of the telegraph and Morse code, Charles Goodyear's invention of rubber, the Singer sewing machine, Thomas Edison's light bulb, Alexander Graham Bell's telephone, all the way up to today, Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak, the Steves, right? We think of them for the personal computer, and Bill Gates for software. And even if you realize, like Ayn Rand's heroes in her books, right? Aspects of what make them heroes is that they're creators and inventors. Howard Roark is an architect, right? He designs new buildings, incredible new creations. Hank Rearden, right? He's not just an industrialist. He invents Rearden metal. He gets a patent on it that the government coercively takes away from him. And of course, John Galt, right? The inventor of an engine that provides unlimited power, an inventor. But innovators are known, and should be known at least, for more than just their inventions. Many innovators are great capitalists. Now, this makes sense if you think about it, because all values that serve human life have to be created and produced by rationally guided action, conceived of by a rational mind, and then produced through the actions that the inventor and their business associates implement. The new products and processes that we now associate with the biotech and biopharmaceutical revolution, right? Our mRNA vaccines. That took 20 some odd years to develop. For those of you who don't know, this was a technology that was conceived in the late 1990s, and that's what made it possible for Moderna to come up with its vaccine. I'm sure you've all heard in just 2 days with the release of the genetic code of the COVID-19 virus. I don't know if you also heard how long it took BioNTech to come up with its version of the vaccine. They did it in 2 hours. This is this unprecedented, incredible technology. And they're now investigating vaccines for malaria and HIV. This is the promise of the biotech revolution that began decades ago in our country. But it's not just these incredible products and services that we benefit from. It's also incredible new commercial mechanisms, new ways of doing business, new types of contracts. In the intellectual property space, we call these licenses. So new ways of licensing between companies and between inventors and companies. New types of business models, ways in which people license and create long, what are sometimes called supply chains. I prefer to call them value chains, where you have companies contributing different parts to create something, right? So we have our smartphones, which conceived by Apple, but produced in China with chips from Taiwan, with glass from Samsung. This is a massive, what business persons call disaggregated supply chain or value chain that's made possible with innovative commercial agreements and licenses between them, respecting the intellectual property and other types of property rights. And there's these incredible commercial innovations, the creation of these long, as I mentioned, disaggregated supply chains, new types of licensing arrangements, new types of commercial forms and corporation business arrangements and things of that sort. These are actually what are necessary to convert these inventions, which occur initially in a lab or maybe sometimes in a garage, right? From there into something that is sold to us in the marketplace, something that we as consumers can buy and benefit from, and the inventor and innovator can benefit from as well. And those types of creations, those intermediary commercial innovations, those are great innovations themselves, and they should be recognized and celebrated as innovations just as much as the products that sell those, that are sold by those innovations are recognized. Now, why is this important? Why is this important? Well, two reasons. First is that innovative commercial innovations are often overlooked or sometimes even outright denigrated compared to the technological innovations that people often associate with our modern economy and modern life. Just to give one small example, in the 1980s and 90s, I don't know if kids do this today, but it was very often I'm a tech geek, and to hear from tech geeks say, well, Steve Jobs, he's an innovator, but Bill Gates, he's just a good businessman. He's not really selling an innovative product or doing anything in a truly innovative way. He's just a good businessman. It's actually not true, either technologically or commercially. And I'm going to be focusing primarily on historical stories today. So if you're interested in hear more about actually why Bill Gates should be heralded as a great innovator, please ask in the Q&A. But it's not true. So not only is it not true, even if it is true, even if he was just a good businessman, that deserves recognition and admiration by itself. Commercial innovation is as necessary for human life as is technological innovation. And to give just another small example where it's not being outright denigrated, but it's being overlooked, is that Steve Jobs, who helped innovate iTunes, which is an incredible technological achievement. It's what made possible, finally, the full practical translation of music into digital media, right? Incredible technological achievement, coming up with the iTunes Store and the MP3 format and the digital rights management programs. They made those possible. But none of that would have worked if Steve Jobs hadn't been able to convince the record players, the record labels, to allow him to sell their music through iTunes. That involved incredible commercial negotiation. And for him to come up with a mechanism, both commercially and otherwise, to convince the record labels to trust him and to trust iTunes in selling their products. And so that was an incredible achievement by itself. And Steve Jobs is famous for that, just inspiring people to be able to do things that they didn't think were possible. And he did that for the record label companies. And yet in his authorized biography by Walter Isaacson, which he goes on for pages about iTunes and the creation of iTunes, and then he says, like in 2 sentences, and then he negotiated with the record label companies to allow them to sell their songs. And I'm like, no, I want to know more. Why aren't you talking about that? But that's because to Walter Isaacson, that wasn't the important accomplishment, but that was just as important. It was just as important as the technological accomplishment that iTunes represented. So it's very important not to even overlook it the way because Isaacson didn't denigrate it, but he just overlooked it. He didn't think it was important, right? Or it's very important not to denigrate it, as sometimes has been done. But there's another reason to also be aware of and sensitive to the importance of commercial innovation. And that is, commercial innovation is as essential and necessary to understanding why intellectual property is valid, especially intellectual property like patents, which is my primary area that I do my work in. Now, I've been explaining in my scholarship for now 2 decades wow, 2 decades, and in my many talks that intellectual property is a type of property. Right? And in fact, for those of you who are interested more in kind of that specific issue, and feel free to ask in the Q&A. For instance, you can watch or listen to my OCON talk from 2017 called Life, Liberty, and Intellectual Property. You can also find my scholarship on these issues and op-eds and other types of work at a website set up by Mark DeCuna, thankfully, called adammossoff.com. It's very easy to find. So you can certainly find further information on that, and you can also ask in the question and answer period. I'm happy to talk about that more broadly. But why is it important to understanding commercial innovation as essential to justifying intellectual property? Well, property rights, in Ayn Rand's definition, the right to acquire, use, and dispose of material values, that is the basis. A property right is the basis for having contracts and exchanges in the free market. It is property rights through contractual exchanges and agreements and transfers, through the trader principle, that we drive economic growth and create a flourishing society. As I teach my students in the first year of law school, property is the subject matter of a contract. What are people contracting over but their property rights, whether it's money or goods that they're exchanging? So you can't have contracts until you have property rights. And in fact, this was the political and legal innovation in the United States. The founders were innovators themselves in many respects, but one of their incredible innovations was to recognize, define, and protect in the law intellectual property as a property right. It's in our Constitution. It's been translated through the Constitution into our legislation and laws enacted by Congress and in court decisions. And it's not just patents, it's also copyrights and trademarks and other types of intellectual property rights. So these have been protected as property rights. And in this way, intellectual property as a property right, just like all property rights, right? Not just in terms of prompting people to come up with inventions, but have served as the basis, therefore, like all property rights, for commercial contracts, people conceiving of new ways of organizing their commercial activities and corporations and business forms. And in fact, this is exactly what happened in the United States as the US displaced England as the source of the Industrial Revolution between the 18th and 19th centuries. And so the Industrial Revolution takes over in the United States, driven by our patented innovations, and continued up through the 20th century, as I already mentioned. The pharmaceutical revolution, the computer revolution of the last half of the 20th century, the biotech revolution at the turn of the 20th century, and today's mobile revolution. These are all revolutions that occurred and began in the United States. And they occurred here because intellectual property didn't just incentivize people to invent, but provided the means as a property right for then the inventors to go out into the world and contract with and exchange with other people, business persons, industrialists, to create the means to translate those inventions into usable product and services that could be sold in the marketplace, right? Now, so if you think that intellectual property is just about incentivizing people to invent, you're missing half of the story of what intellectual property does for inventors and for us, the consumers, who buy and benefit from their valuable innovations. Because we can't get their valuable innovations unless they have a property right that they can then transact with and turn it into a good that can be sold in the marketplace and that we can therefore buy. And this is why the United States, as I mentioned, took over and displaced England as a source of innovation and has driven innovation throughout the entire world since then. Now, the structure of my talk, therefore, is to just kind of go over some great examples of great innovators who, especially historically in the United States, who we know for their inventions, but many people don't know of them actually for their incredible commercial innovations, which is what made us know about their great inventions. Because the humans are naturally inventive, right? We are rational animals. In fact, England is often recognized. They came up with lots of great inventions and continuing to do so up through the 19th and 20th centuries, but they were never able to translate those inventions into real-world innovations. And that's what the US did with IP as a property right, by providing this commercializable asset, a property right, right? And so I'm going to be talking about these great inventors who have got patents on their inventions and what they did in the marketplace with their patented inventions to make it possible for them not just to become incredibly wealthy and successful, but to benefit also the rest of the United States and ultimately the world. Now, these insights apply equally to copyright and trademark. I'm primarily focusing on patents because A, as I said, I'm a tech geek, so I can't help but talk about patents. But B, I do patent law. It's my primary area. But I also do teach copyrights and trademarks and things of that sort. And in fact, there's great stories as well of how copyright has driven innovation in academic publishing and in the movie industry. So if you're interested in kind of broader stories outside of patented technologies, I'm happy to talk about that in the question and answer period. So I'm going to talk about some of their stories, illustrate with real world examples how this has happened, what this represents, conclude by just drawing some of the broader principles again that we can recognize from this, and then hopefully we'll have, and not hopefully, I'm aiming for this, I'm timing myself to, so that we can have lots of time for question and answer period, where you should feel to ask me anything about intellectual property, because lots of people usually have questions about intellectual property. So let's start. All right, so these are just a few examples. There are innumerable examples. Most great inventors, we know them as great inventors because they were also great commercial innovators as well. So I'm just highlighting a few examples of great inventors who are known for their great inventions, so that we can have some time for Q&A. Otherwise, we'd be here for like a week, which I wouldn't mind doing, but I'm sure you guys all have to want to go home eventually and things of this sort. Go to the gala tonight. So, of course, Cyrus Mccormick invents the Mechanized Reaper. Isaac Singer sewing machines. Charles Goodyear, rubber. Samuel Morse invents the telegraph, although we primarily know of him through Morse code, which he also invented. And, of course, you could not talk about innovation in America without talking about Thomas Edison, just the pinnacle of the innovator. But many of these people are not known, as I mentioned, for their commercial innovations. We know them for their inventions, which I just mentioned. And the point of my quickly going over these stories is not for you to get down every single fact. So, first, because I talk very quickly, as you've noticed. But the point is just for you to appreciate these stories of great, admirable innovators in their achievements. Get down a few facts, and then if you like, watch it again or Google it and take advantage of our resources in our incredible interconnected world today. All right, so you ready to jump in? All right, let's talk about Cyrus Mccormick. So these are from his, he got 2 patents on his invention of the Mechanized Reaper, as I mentioned. That's what he's known for. This is actually the first device that had the name labor-saving device, as we'll talk about in a moment. His first patent issued, so do I have a laser pointer on here? Yes. This is his first patent from 1834. Got a second patent. You can always see this is the drawing from the patent. Patents also describe the invention. There's a lot of words that go with it. But they also always have a drawing. This is 1847. This is not the original patent. Unfortunately, there was a fire at the patent office in 1836, and they lost all the patents. And so they only were able to reacquire patents by getting copies that people had. And so this is you can see it's from a newspaper, actually, that his patent was republished in. And, of course, there's his company, the McCormick Harvesting Machinery Company. As I mentioned, his device, his invention, the Mechanized Reaper, you can see it's on its side here. It's not, you're not looking at it as if it would be, right? Well, but because before him, this is how people harvested crops, with a device called a scythe. We know of the scythe now because of the Grim Reaper, but that was actually a tool that was used to harvest crops. And it wasn't like in this beautiful Winslow Homer painting. This Winslow Homer is one of my favorite artists, a veteran in the field. It was thousands of people in the field with their scythes, cutting down the crops, hand picking them up, carrying them over to be processed. At the time of McCormick's invention, 75% of the US population worked in agriculture. That's how much it took, right? So imagine tens of thousands of this individual in the fields, day in, day out. It was back-breaking labor. It was difficult. It was hot. It was hard. As a result of Cyrus McCormick's innovation, today, 5% of the US population works in agriculture. And they produce, by orders of magnitude, far more food. And in fact, we feed the world in many respects. This invention literally freed up people. This is why I know it's a labor-saving device. Literally freed up people so that they could move to towns and work in factories. But for Cyrus McCormick inventing the Mechanized Reaper, the Industrial Revolution would have been delayed because they wouldn't have had the access to the labor to work in the factories to produce the goods. And so here's a drawing from an old newspaper. You see, so what would be thousands of people is now 2 people, right? Guy on a horse and a guy kind of operating the reaper in the back as it's cutting down very quickly, very efficiently. Massive increase in efficiency in the harvesting of crops in terms of quantity and quality. For those of you who read The Little House on the Prairie, there's an entire chapter in that book where they describe that they got a mechanized reaper, and it's beautiful in their description of how amazing it was and how they were able to harvest their crops like within a half a day when it usually took them like 2 weeks to do it and things of this sort. So it's another great example of why that book's so awesome, or at least for someone like as a tech geek. But going from hand scythes to mechanical devices like this is not easy. It's not easy, right? So here's another advertisement from back then. You see, so I didn't mean to. Sorry, there's just one person here, right? Not two. So this is a little later. This is a little more advanced. Notice here it's a patent automatic sheaf delivery attachment. So, and there's the advertisement for contacting the patent agent for purchasing and licensing and sales. Why is it not easy to go from a scythe to a mechanized reaper? Well, because farmers were not trained in how to use machines, right? These new complex machines. And there was another problem. Not only were they not trained in machines, they didn't have the money to buy the reaper. Farmers lived largely from hand to mouth. And when did they get their money? When they harvested their crops and they took them to market and sold them at market. Well, but they needed to buy the machine to harvest the crops that then gave them the money. They didn't have the money before they harvested the crops. It was a classic catch-22. Cyrus McCormick could not sell his mechanized reapers. Farmers said, I don't know how to use it, and I don't have the money to buy it. So Cyrus McCormick came up with 3 incredible innovations. He invented and is known for the creation of what's now called an installment purchase program, right? So he came up with the idea for the very first time of 2 payments to buy something. Farmer makes a small down payment to acquire the machine, like 5% of the purchase value. And then after the farmer harvests the crops and in fact massively increases the efficiency of harvesting and makes even more money, has the money then to pay for the machine for the rest of it, right? So that was a great innovation. And it was necessary because the farmers didn't have the money. So they wouldn't have actually acquired his mechanized reaper. But he still had the problem that farmers weren't trained in using these machines, and these machines broke down, and they broke down a lot. Imagine how many times your devices at home break down and stop working, and you say, well, I'll just buy a new one. I'll just get a new phone, right? They didn't, there wasn't an Apple store to go to in the 1830s and 40s. So he came up with the very first post-sale customer service program. You're a farmer and you buy a McCormick harvester, we will have trained mechanics. So if your harvester breaks down in the middle of the field while you're harvesting your crops, send a person to our local McCormick harvester company, and we will send a trained mechanic to your field to fix your harvester for you right then and there so you can get back to harvesting your crops. So again, a necessary for the sale of his product, because people weren't going to buy a machine that broke down and then they didn't know what to do with it. And they're like, oh, now I just paid all this money to buy a machine and I'm back to swinging a scythe again, right? And he backed it up even more because, again, there was still some suspicion. Yeah, but it's a big, complicated machine. Is it really going to advance my efficiency of my harvesting and make me harvest more? So he backed up his sales with a quality back guarantee. Very first time this was done too. He said, if you don't actually harvest more crops as a result of the use of my harvester, you can get your money back. You don't have to pay for the harvester. But he was that confident in the value of his technology, but he realized he had to sell it because there were these commercial and technological knowledge limitations by his customers, farmers, that he had to address that were distinct from the actual technological innovation of coming up with the mechanized reaper. But the result of his ingenuity, right, is of course the disproving of Malthus's thesis that humans were destined to starve because our population growth would inevitably outgrow our ability to harvest and grow crops to feed us. And we disproved that through innovations like McCormick's harvester. But his ingenuity, again, was not just in the technological achievement of the harvester itself. It was his commercial innovations that were just as necessary to have it adopted and have the impact that it did. Well, just a few years later, you have another incredible amount of innovation by another great inventor and business person, Isaac Singer of Singer Sewing Machine Company. So I assume a lot of you here have heard of a Singer sewing machine. You may have seen a Singer sewing machine or even used one. Before I began doing my research on sewing machines many years ago, I had never actually used or seen one, so this was all kind of new to me. I actually bought an old sewing machine. But it was this, just out of curiosity, show of hands, who here has actually used or seen a Singer sewing machine? Oh, awesome. Usually I ask that of my students, I get like 2 hands. So there's the drawing from his patent in 1851. Is an advertisement from Singer Sewing, and then here's a painting of him from the 1850s, or a little later in life, actually, 1860s. Now, he was actually one of many inventive contributors to the sewing machine. I'm actually, in fact, in patent law circles, I'm known as the sewing machine guy, because I wrote an article on the invention of the sewing machine in the 19th century and how it led to all this patent litigation and things of this sort. But that the sewing machine really was the smartphone of the 19th century. There were a lot of different people who had to contribute to it. It was a technological problem that had been worked on for about 100 years until U.S. inventors kind of overcame it. A lot of different people contributed elements to what was the final practicable, usable sewing machine. They all started suing each other because they had patents. It was called the Sewing Machine War of the 1850s. And then when they were done suing each other, they got down to manufacturing, and Singer Sewing Machine Company quickly becomes very famous. Now, this is a little counterintuitive because of all of the major sewing machine manufacturers at that time, there were 2 others, Grover and Baker and Wheeler and Wilson. Singer was the only one not using what was known as the American system of manufacturing. Now, the American system of manufacturing was another great innovation which was the invention of machine-tooled interchangeable parts to use in products that are composed of lots of different parts, which they often are. Eli Whitney, who's also known as the inventor of the cotton gin, a device for harvesting cotton, is often identified as the inventor of the American system of manufacturing. It's a little bit of a myth. He came up with the idea, but he actually didn't fully implement it. And the American system of manufacturing was first applied to the manufacturing of firearms, to making of muskets and things of the sort. The sewing machine was the very first civilian product that the American system of manufacturing was applied to on a mass scale for mass production. And as I mentioned, Singer didn't do that. Singer made sewing machines the old-fashioned way by people with hand processing them and hand putting them together. So what then accounted for his successes? Because he wasn't enjoying the efficiency and the benefits of the American system of manufacturing. Well, he was an incredibly innovative business person, as I mentioned. He famously said that I'm interested only in, quote, the dimes, not the invention, end quote. He was very much driven by the profit motive. He had a flair for the flamboyant, which you get a sense of from the painting. He was an opera singer originally. And so he understood the need to sell the sewing machine, which by the way, was just as necessary as it was for McCormick to come up with how to sell the Mechanized Reaper, although for slightly different reasons. There was incredible opposition to this sewing machine. There was a lot of complaints from the existing industry at that time, which relied on seamstresses sewing by hand and buildings filled with hundreds of women sewing things by hand. You're going to put all of these seamstresses out of work, and they're all going to be destitute. And this was not a mere theoretical argument made in the kind of policy debates. 2 decades before Singer creates his final inventive contributions to make the practical sewing machine, Luddites in France attacked and destroyed a factory of industrial sewing machines for precisely this reason. They were like, you're going to put us all out of work. And so he recognized that there was this opposition to sewing machines, against same type of opposition to machinery more generally. But also Singer he also recognized he had to overcome a lot of prejudices at that time. He himself had those same prejudices about women, that people thought that women were either incapable of using machines or that they shouldn't use machines. So it was either improper or they just couldn't do it, right? Women were dainty and delicate, and they shouldn't be using machines, and sewing machine is a machine. He himself had this same chauvinism and bigotry. When he was first shown some sewing machines that had broken down in a shop that his business partners used, that's what got him involved in the inventive activities of the sewing machine. His initial response to it was, quote, "What a devilish machine. You want to do away with the only thing that keeps women quiet. They're sewing," end quote. So I told you he was flamboyant. But he was willing to overcome his own prejudices and to sell the sewing machine to overcome other people's prejudices because he was interested in those dimes. And boy, did he make a lot of them. As we well know, because Singer's Sewing Machine Company, his company, is still in existence to this very day, 170 years later. How did he do this? Well, he actually is one of the people who came up with the very idea of mass marketing. Mass marketing. He understood this already because he has this flair for the flamboyant. He originally wanted to name his sewing machine, not the Singer sewing machine, but the Jenny Lind sewing machine. Now, I don't know if any of you know who Jenny Lind was. At the time, she was a very famous opera singer. Actually, a lot of you may know of her now. Who here has seen The Greatest Showman, the movie from 2017 with Hugh Jackson? She's the opera singer in that movie. That's why she's in that movie. She actually had a business relationship with P.T. Barnum. There's a lot of artistic license in that movie, by the way. But she was very famous. But he was convinced, no, name it the Singer Sewing Machine Company. And like Steve Jobs with Apple, Singer becomes the public face of his company. So he goes to county fairs and creates songs and sings at county fairs about how awesome the sewing machine is and how you don't have to sew by hand anymore, and does all these performances. He creates a company newsletter, a company newspaper that they sell as a newspaper with advertisements and op-eds about how awesome the sewing machine is. But also he knew that women would be the people using the sewing machine. So as I mentioned, he was prejudiced, but he was willing to overcome his own prejudices. So the very first person actually hired by Singer Sewing Machine Company was a woman. And Singer Sewing Machine Company quickly hired mostly women to work as saleswomen because they wanted women to teach women how to use the machines. They knew that women would be more comfortable if another woman was doing it, but also he knew that that would create a sensation. In fact, he was known for, in his Singer Sewing Machine shops in New York City and other cities, he would put one of those saleswomen in the front window pane of the shop working the sewing machine. And there are reports of how this would create great sensations. People would gather around the shop. They're like, there's a woman using a machine. and then some of the women in the audience on the street in the audience watching this would then go into the shop, and then there would be women there to train them how to use it. And so this helped create sensations, both his singing about it and using women to exploit the prejudices and bigotry of the people at the time, against them, to sell them, to make them aware of how cool this machine was. But he does more than just that. He actually comes up with also mass marketing here. Sorry, I forgot to hit the clicker. This is a drawing from his newspaper, one of his newspapers in 1853. And again, a woman using a machine, right? This mere drawing by itself, this is pre-photographs at the time, would have been like, whoa, this is incredible. Like, what's happening here? So he also comes up with other commercial innovations. He comes up with an installment purchase plan. Now, as I mentioned, Cyrus Mccormick is often identified as the inventor of the installment purchase plan, but he's really not. He's the person who comes up with the idea that you don't have to buy something with a single payment, but his program was only 2 payments, and it was always just 2 payments, before the harvest and after the harvest. It's Singer who actually comes up with what we now call rent-to-own, which I don't think really exists much anymore, given things like Amazon and things of that sort. But those of us who are over the age of probably 40 or 50 very well know about this service. It was used by Kmart and JCPenney, and for you youngins, those are all companies that have been put out of business by all the great commercial and technological innovations of the past few years. But why did he come up with the installment purchase program, the rent-to-own program? Well, because a significant barrier to the adoption of the sewing machine was its price, because the sewing machines were made out of the only metal that they had at that time, which is iron. And iron is a really hard material to work with, and it's hard, and it's very labor intensive. This is my sewing machine that I bought. This is a 150-year-old sewing machine. It's from the 1870s. It's a Wheeler and Wilson. I wanted to get a Singer, but Singers were like a couple $100, and this was $25 on Craigslist. So I said, all right, I'll get the $25 one. So these were made of iron. They were very expensive. And you might think, well, $125, that's not a lot of money, right? I mean, but this was at a time when the average American family earned an estimated less than $500 a year. So you're talking about more than 25% of their total annual income would go to a sewing machine. And so there was a serious problem with the price point of how do you sell this device. Here's a drawing from 1856 of a Singer sewing machine. You can see even the table is made of iron. Here's the treadle. It says Singer there. Singer invented the treadle, which is the pivoting foot pedal which provides continuous power to run the sewing machine through a drive belt. And so he invents rent-to-own, installment purchase. For those of you who don't know what rent-to-own is, you pay a rental fee every month for a set period of time. It can be a year or 2 years or 3 years. A portion of the rental fee, you're just renting it. So you sign a lease like you sign for a rent for your apartment. But a portion of your rental payment goes to paying the principal. And after a certain number of years, you paid off the principal and you own it. And so this was a way for people to make small payments and therefore ultimately work up to paying the full amount of the $125. And so in his newsletter in 1855, this is a great description. He says, quote, or I said his newsletter, I keep calling it that. It's newspaper, it was actually a newspaper. Quote, why not rent a sewing machine to the housewife? And notice the line there. Why not rent a sewing machine to the housewife and apply the rental fee to the purchase price of the machine? Her husband cannot accuse her of running into a debt since he's merely hiring or renting the machine and under no obligation to buy. Yet at the end of the period of the lease, he will own a sewing machine for the money, end quote. And this was incredibly and massively successful. In the first year that he implemented it, tripled the sales at Singer Sewing Machine, tripled the number of sewing machines that they were selling every year. But he had to do more because the sewing machines were still very expensive. As I mentioned, they're made of iron. You can see that in the drawing. So how did you lower the price even more? Well, he invents the very first trade-in program. Trade in an old Singer sewing machine, and you'll get $50 off the purchase price of a new sewing machine. Well, dropping the price from $125 to $75 is a significant drop in the cost of something, right? But this was an even more important development, right? Which is, as I mentioned, they're made of iron. They last forever. As I said, this is the sewing machine in my office at my law school. This is 150 years old, as I said, right? They last forever. So this program forestalled the development of a secondary market, what economists call a secondary market, in used sewing machines. So how do you prevent used sewing machines from preventing you from selling new sewing machines? Well, get the used sewing machines off the market. Have people who own their sewing machines return them back to you to get a rebate on a new sewing machine. But then he comes up with an even better innovation. He came up with the idea of, well, turn in any other manufacturer's sewing machine too, and we'll give you the same rebate on a Singer sewing machine. Again, massively increasing the sales of sewing machines. And this is why Singer Sewing Machine becomes the most famous of all the sewing machine manufacturers. In fact, the Singer Sewing Machine Company becomes the very first US company that is a multinational corporation. In the 1860s, the Singer Sewing Machine Company was selling more sewing machines in Europe than it was in the United States. And the Singer Sewing Machine Factory that was built in New Jersey in the 1870s at the time was the largest factory in the entire country. So incredibly successful company, and as all incredibly successful companies too, it also has the ignoble distinction because of its success of in the mid-20th century having an antitrust action brought against it by the US government as well. So that's another way that you know that it was an incredibly successful company. All right, so another innovation that IP owners and patent owners in particular came up with in the 19th century is the franchise business model. Now, we know the franchise business model now primarily through fast food. So McDonald's and Burger King and things of this sort, right? You know that, or you may not, now you will, that the actual Burger King or McDonald's you go to is not owned by McDonald's. It's owned by someone who is distinct corporately from McDonald's. They have just simply bought all of the rights from McDonald's Corporation to set up and run a McDonald's. It's a way to efficiently deploy in the marketplace products and services, because the original company doesn't have to make an outlay of resources and capital to create their own storefronts. Other people make those investments who have the capital and the labor to do so. Well, this business model wasn't about fast food. This business model was originally developed by IP owners. It's an IP licensing business model, right? Because even in the fast food context, what the franchise owner is simply buying from McDonald's is the rights to use the McDonald's logo, the rights to use their trade secrets and making their shakes and things of the sort. Those are trade secrets, by the way, if there's McDonald's shakes, and there are other types of intellectual property that they have. Well, this licensing business model where IP owners contract with other people to manufacture and to make their products, as I mentioned, was created and developed in the 19th century by US inventors who were thinking about more efficient ways to use their property rights to deploy them in the marketplace. This business model is an example of what Adam Smith recognized in The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, of what he identified as a foundational principle in economics of specialization or division of labor. Right? In his example, his very famous example is pin. He says, why is a pin so cheap? Well, because there's one person who actually ores it, who digs it out of the ground. There's then the person who digs it out of the ground gives it to another person who transports it to a factory. Then the different person at the factory processes it. Then that person sells it to a wholesaler. Wholesaler then sells it to a retailer. The retailer is then what sells it to the market. Each person can specialize and become more efficient and more productive in their particular skill set at each of those stages of what we now call a value chain. And therefore, the pin ends up being mass produced in a much higher quantity and much more efficiently. It becomes much more cheap, and we all benefit from that, as do all of the manufacturers and producers. Well, this was quickly recognized as that this should be deployed in innovation markets. So an inventor is really good at inventing, but that doesn't mean they're good as an industrialist or as a manufacturer. They're good at inventing, so they should keep doing what they do best, inventing. So they should invent, and then they should transfer their rights, the right to manufacture, to an industrialist who's really good at manufacturing. And that person will then transfer the rights to what were in the 19th century were called jobbers. We now call them wholesalers and retailers, to sell and retail these products and services to consumers. And so you create that same distribution of specialization and division of labor. And there are a tremendous number of examples of this in the 19th century. All of these inventors were people who developed and innovated and benefited from intellectual property licensing, more specifically patent licensing, where they invented and then they did not manufacture. They did not then create their own factory and manufacture and come up with their own stores to sell and things of this sort. They transferred their rights to other people to do that, where those people could have both the resources to do it and the knowledge to do it. They could continue to invent. Charles Goodyear, you're probably all a little confused, like, why is Charles Goodyear on here? Because there's the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. You're like, didn't he create his own company? And it's a great question. The Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company actually has nothing to do with Goodyear except being named after him. In fact, the Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company was created 40 years after he died, because he was so famous as the inventor of the process for making rubber a practical, usable commodity. So it was called the vulcanization process. And because rubber in heat it becomes viscous and runs like syrup, and in cold becomes very brittle and breaks, right? So not so good. Rubber's not usable. If it becomes brittle and breaks, it's not going to be usable like as a life preserver in the Atlantic if your ship goes down, right? Or in a heat wave, or if you're in Austin, to have your tires melting on your car. So the vulcanization process is a heating process and uses sulfur and other chemicals to make rubber a stable product. So it doesn't turn into liquid and heat and becomes brittle and cold, and it becomes a usable product. This drove the entire Industrial Revolution. Rubber then gets put into everything, in machines and products, and it's in everything you own, from your shoes, it's in your phones, it's ubiquitous. Well, Goodyear was just a crazy inventor. If you went to New Haven in the 1840s and you said, I want to see Goodyear, they would say, look for the guy who's walking on the street who's got like rubber patches on his coat and a rubber hat and rubber shoes and is mumbling to himself. That's Goodyear. So he loved rubber. He comes up with this process in his wife's kitchen, ruined her pots and pans, and then proceeds to write a 2-volume treatise on how awesome rubber is, which includes just tens of pages of you can use it in umbrellas, and you can put it in coats, and you can put it in carriages, and it's just listing all of the awesome uses of rubber. And to prove his point, he had his treatise bound in rubber. So he didn't want to manufacture. He just wanted to continue to experiment and work with rubber. So he actually employed in this licensing business model, transferring his rights to other people to manufacture, and transferring, like, you can make 100 umbrellas and sell them in Boston, or you can make 100 shoes and sell them in Michigan. And by the way, this is an exercise of his property rights. He's exercising his right to dispose of his property and control what he's transferring to people in the marketplace. And this is how his invention quickly becomes just adopted throughout the entire economy, because also he didn't have to front the money to make all of these different manufacturing facilities and all this thing, because those people brought their own capabilities to these agreements. Samuel Morse is not a crazy inventor like Goodyear, but is still out-of-the-box innovator. So he invents the first electromagnetic telegraph. The telegraph is the internet of the 19th century, right? The telegraph, we've lost complete sense of how revolutionary this was. Before his invention of the telegraph in the 1830s, the speed of transmission of information was limited to horseback or sailing ship. And with the invention of the telegraph, it goes by the speed of electrons. In fact, he's called the lightning man, and his telegraph is referred to as the lightning line. And it's just revolution, and it starts the telecommunications revolution that continues today with our mobile revolution. But he was not a trained technician. He was a professor of art at NYU. In fact, he was a very famous artist at the time, right? So when he invents the telegraph, if you go to the Smithsonian, they actually have his original patent model that he. Actually, not just the model, his first working version of the telegraph from 1836. It's on display at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. You'll see, actually, it's on it's wood, and if you know that he's a professor of art, you'll immediately recognize that it's a canvas wood frame. So because he was doing this in his apartment, so he was just using the materials he had on hand. He hated business, so he didn't want to be a business person. He just wanted to be an artist, and so he transfers his rights to Amos Kendall and works with Amos Kendall to create a franchise business model where they license the right to other companies to install telegraph lines throughout the country. And this is why the telegraph quickly spreads within decades. In fact, it's the first transatlantic telegraph line is installed a mere 20 years after he invents the telegraph, connecting England and the United States with information that can be transmitted within 5 minutes of what used to take 3 weeks by sailing ship. So it's just, incredible change in how people communicated. Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, continuing the telecommunications revolution. He originally tried to sell his patent outright, as a property right, to Western Union for $30,000. And Western Union said, well, why does anyone need a telephone? They have telegraphs. So seriously. So they said, we don't want it. We don't want to buy it from you. So he's like, all right, I have to become a businessman. I have to start selling this myself. But he was not a business person. He was actually an academic who specialized in auditory issues. And so he didn't have the capital or ability to set up telephone lines. So he does the exact same thing that Morse did, following Morse's successful embrace of the franchise business model, licensing other people to install telephone systems throughout the country. And Thomas Edison, so our great famous inventor and innovator, and Thomas Edison, he was a professional inventor. I'll be talking about him in a little minute, but he licensed and transferred his rights and his great innovations to other companies. He was also involved a bit more in the business of his inventions, but he made a lot of his money and funded a lot of his inventive activities at Menlo Park, and I'll be talking about him in just a moment because he gets his own treatment, with the licensing and transfer of his interests. So he wasn't sitting at, running Edison Light. He was at Menlo Park doing inventions, but he had transferred and licensed to other people to use his name as a trademark and to deploy, manufacture, and sell his inventions and great innovations. This continues to this very day, this licensing business model. It's deployed by almost every major company that we know of. Apple. For those of you who are Apple consumers, I actually am an Android person with my Samsung, originally a patent infringement. But Apple, if you notice when you buy your Apple, what does the box say? Does it say manufactured in Cupertino? It says designed in Cupertino. That's not an accident, because it literally is designed in Cupertino, where they get their IP rights on it. And then they license with other companies like Foxconn in China, and Samsung to provide the glass, and TMC in Taiwan to provide the semiconductor chips, and so on, to manufacture the phone. Apple actually does not manufacture a single iPhone, right? It's all these other companies who do it for them through their business agreements, through these global supply chains that we now have. Microsoft doesn't just license Windows to be used on computers. During the whole debacle of Windows 8, the thing that had kept actually Microsoft in business was that it was making over $1 billion a year from licensing of the patents that it had in the technology used in the Android smartphone. And how many Android smartphones does Microsoft sell? 0, right? But its technology was being used by Google, Samsung, and all these other companies who were licensing the rights to manufacture and sell these products. Qualcomm is the inventor of smartphone technology. They are the inventor of the G in 2G, 3G, 4G. They used to make phones back in the 90s when they realized, we're not really good at this. We don't want to do this anymore. What we're really good at is coming up with the Gs. So they licensed the G to Apple, to Samsung, to HTC, to Huawei, to sell and to use in their phones. University of Wisconsin, universities engage in patent licensing because lots of innovations come from universities, and they engage in what's called tech transfer, which is that they just license other companies to use their technologies that are invented by their professors and their graduate students. A lot of people don't know that Larry Page and Sergey Brin invented their search algorithm, their PageRank search algorithm, when they were graduate students at Stanford, and they got a patent on it. And so Stanford owned that patent because they were graduate students. They did it as work for them. Stanford made $300 million off of Google because when they spun out and when they created the startup in Google, they had a license from Stanford to use the patented technology. And this is how universities fund a lot of their scholarships, research activities, and other things, through what's called a tech transfer process, where they license the technologies invented by their graduate students and inventors. And this is why you have all these startups created in Boston out of Harvard and MIT, and why startups actually, you see a lot of startups here in Austin, out of UT Austin, and in college towns, because the professors then create a business, leave the university to do the startup like Sergey Brin and Larry Page did, and they licensed the technology. And then BioNTech and Pfizer, we call it the Pfizer vaccine. Pfizer didn't invent it. It was invented by BioNTech. BioNTech licensed it to Pfizer. BioNTech is just a little startup company. So they had what we call the innovation capital, but they didn't have the labor capital, manufacturing capacity, or anything else to do the scale-up necessary to produce the vaccine. So they licensed with Pfizer. So these are just all examples of the success of the licensing process. And as I mentioned, Edison was a user of this. He was known as the Wizard of Menlo Park. These are just some of his inventions. The record player, he called it the phonograph. First practical incandescent light bulb. Then he invents power grids and electrical power generators, direct current, to power his light bulb. Invents motion pictures, what he called the kinetograph. First zinc magnesium battery, and so on and so on. He even made key improvements to Alexander Graham Bell's telephone that were necessary. Total number of patents he got was over 1,000, as you see. But he wasn't just an inventor. He innovated something even more important. He came up with the idea of the Invention Factory, an entire company whose sole purpose is to come up with inventions, to get patents on those inventions, and then use licensing, contracts, and other deals to work with other companies, manufacturers, and retailers to then just deploy those products and services in the marketplace. This was what Menlo Park was. It was the very first invention factory. It was the very first research and development company. And in fact, the modern successors to his invention factory at Menlo Park are Bell Labs, which was a subsidiary of AT&T. And you can read an incredible book about Bell Labs. All they did was invent. It was an R&D, but they came up with the transistor, the first semiconductor. The transistor. Then they came up with they didn't come up with the first semiconductor chip, but they came up with, I apologize, that was at Hewlett-Packard. But they came up with microwave technology, satellite technology, cell technology, and they didn't manufacture a single thing. They licensed other companies then to deploy these products in the marketplace. 3M. You all know 3M from Post-it notes and things like that sort. You probably don't realize that 3M doesn't make a single thing. They're just an R&D company where they license their rights to other companies to make their products. And part of their licensing is it comes from us, so you got to put your name on it. But they don't do the actual manufacturing themselves. They're just an invention factory. But every single R&D department in every single major company today is a successor to Edison's idea. You can put a lot of people in a single room or a department and tell them, work on this problem and come up with a solution. And that's what he came up with. And that is the incredible innovation that has born even more technological innovations that we have benefited from. For those of you interested, I highly recommend a book called The Invention Factory. It's the title of the book. It's about Bell Labs. And it's just an incredible story. So in conclusion, I just want to note that all of these examples, right, show that all creative or inventive labors are from the same fundamental source, right? The rational mind of the individual who practices the virtue of productivity. And this is true whether you're inventing a light bulb or whether you're coming up with the idea of a research and development company or a research and development department. So the inventor deserves recognition, and the business person deserves equal recognition. And many times the inventor and the business person are the same person, because the innovation is the same. It's this irrational mind coming up with new ways of creating values that benefit themselves and others. Edison, Goodyear, McCormick, and all of these people give us a better understanding of how property rights like patents function also in a free market. Because what you see is that patents don't just prompt people to invent, which is how a lot of people think of what IP does. Well, we just need to incentivize people to invent. It's not about dangling that carrot in front of the inventors saying, invent something and you'll get a patent. It's much more important than that. It's about providing a mechanism for bridging that act of invention into the marketplace. And that's often the metaphor that you hear a lot of patent lawyers and others use, that patents and other intellectual property rights are the bridge. But I prefer the bridge between the lab and the garage and the marketplace. But I prefer, I think, a much more apt metaphor is that patents are a launching pad for innovation, because they just create and lead to explosive, incredible new uses of technologies in the world and benefit, as I said, not just the inventors, but everyone through the trader principles it's implemented in the free market. And so it's really important to recognize intellectual property does not just incentivize people to invent. That's not why we have intellectual property. If that's the sole way of understanding of it, then there's nothing that differentiates IP from monopoly grants, prize systems, and other types of ways that you can incentivize people to invent, which is what people have done for centuries. But what we did in the United States was something that was a true innovation. We said you don't just get a prize or a monopoly grant. You get a property right. And that property right will be protected and recognized for the same reasons that we recognize a property right in the farmer who labors for a year to plant, grow, and ultimately harvest his or her crops with a reaper, a mechanized reaper, and benefit from the fruits of those labors. The innovators can do the same with their property rights and their innovations. And in fact, ultimately, at even a higher level, this gives us an even better understanding of Rand's key insight that the rational mind is man's basic means of survival. Because what you see is all innovations, and therefore all property, is fundamentally intellectual in its source, no matter whether you're talking about commercial innovation or technological innovation. And this is why Rand recognized in her essay, Patents and Copyrights, that intellectual property rights are, quote, the implementation of the base of all property rights, the man's right to the product of his mind. And you know this as illustrated beautifully by Ayn Rand and Hank Rearden, both an industrialist and an inventor, and John Galt as an incredible inventor and philosopher. But you should also know of it by reference to real people as well, not just by artistic tropes. Edison, Cyrus McCormick, Alexander Graham Bell, and so many others also should serve in your mind as the exemplars of this key and important and fundamental insight by Ayn Rand. So thank you. So we'll take questions now. And so we'll alternate periodically between live, in person, and on the web, using our incredible technologies for streaming. But we'll take the first question in person here. So yes.
Hi. First of all, great lecture. I really enjoyed. Thank you so much. I have a question about integrity.
Yes.
John Galt, for me, has great integrity, and he really made his work and innovation out of motivation. Mm-hmm. And when comparing to Edison, especially when I'm thinking about Tesla and the fight about like the electricity grid, I think that I don't know, maybe he compromised his integrity for his innovative integrity in order to do. And it feels like there is difference between coming from the state of mind of business and the state of mind of innovation?
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. Remember from Dr. Tara Smith's talk where she mentioned that errors of knowledge are not breaches of integrity. And so ultimately the dispute between Tesla and Edison, where Tesla invents alternating current, AC, and Edison invented direct current, DC, and they had a massive dispute over this. By the way, Edison, because patents were property rights, had transferred his patents in his power grid and generators to General Electric. Tesla transferred his patents to Westinghouse. So the actual fight was between Westinghouse and General Electric. But they both believed in the virtues and benefits of their respective systems. And there may have been some mistakes, but at the end of the day, actually, the dispute between alternating current and direct current, in this particular dispute between Edison and Tesla, was really a dispute over business models and technological capabilities in the market. And the patent lawsuit was really between Westinghouse and General Electric was really a proxy fight for what was a business model fight, because alternating current is transmitted at much higher voltages. So, and that's why you have to have transformers to step them down as you get closer to users, to homes and other places that are using it. And so you can create factories or generating factories much further away, and you don't have to make as many. So you can put factories way out in the middle of nowhere, or at Niagara Falls and places like that. Whereas for Edison, for direct current, it has to be much closer because it didn't translate with this high energy level. And so you had to have like in fact, his very first power plant was created in Manhattan. Because that's where he set up his first light bulbs and electricity system was in downtown Manhattan. So you had different capital investments, fewer factories, with broader, larger just wires and power grids running systems throughout the country, and greater efficiency in the use because you had greater electrical charge being sent through alternating current systems. But by the way, your devices can't run on alternating current. So that's why you have those little bricks that come with your phones and your computers, because the alternating current still has to be converted into direct current, because that's what is run. That's actually what runs on your devices, because otherwise your devices would be turning on and off, on and off, on and off, and that wouldn't work for you. That's why it's alternating current. So they were both right, and they got in a huge fight over it because Edison was like, I invented direct current, so this is what needs to be used. And Tesla said, I invented alternating current, and this is what needs to be used. And they were both right. And so I appreciate, right now there's a tremendous, for those who know, there's a tremendous dispute. Like there are Tesla fans and Edison fans, and I don't have a dog in that fight. I do have two dogs, beagles, which by the way are named Edison and Tesla. And what I always tell people is, because they're littermates, that yes, they fight, but just like their namesakes, at heart, they really love each other. And they did. And actually, in real life, they did. Edison and Tesla respected each other. If you've seen the movie, there's a movie called The Electricity Wars. It's a horrible movie. There's just so many. To say artistic license was taken in that movie is to be unkind to actually people who actually engage in artistic license. That just movie has so many falsehoods in it. So don't rely on that movie. But they were both right, and inventors, believe in their systems, and sometimes they don't fully see or understand the full practical application. You see, you have a follow-up, but I'd love to chat with you some more, but I want to make sure we get to the other people. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Oh,
Yes.
We
online.
have a question from the online audience.
Yeah, sure, great, yeah.
So they ask, we've seen efforts to take away patents for COVID vaccines. Dr. Adalja briefly talked about this earlier. What do you think the consequences would be if these efforts come to fruition? And they ask if you can elaborate a little bit on this topic of the COVID vaccines in particular.
Yeah, it's a great question. I've been involved in these policy disputes in Washington, D.C. and in the broader international space. I published an op-ed on this back in April, criticizing this effort, and I'm going to be publishing what's called a white paper, which is kind of it's like a 15-page paper by the Heritage Foundation about a week and a half on this issue. Does everyone here know about this? So there's this push. It's called the Ip Waiver, intellectual property waiver at the World Trade Organization that the Biden administration has announced its support for. So now it's not a waiver of our rights domestically. It doesn't affect how intellectual property rights and patents, trade secrets, and other IP rights are affected under domestic law. It's a waiver from the international treaty that's signed among many countries of the enforcement of intellectual property rights internationally. Because intellectual property rights are domestic, they're under US law and under German law and under British law, and so we have to have a treaty. It's called TRIPS, Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property, that's governed since 1995, various enforcement mechanisms through the World Trade Organization for ensuring that countries respect intellectual property, especially intellectual property from other countries. And so that's what they're trying to say, is waive that so that India and South Africa, which were the two countries that proposed the IP waiver, could then just start manufacturing vaccines without having trade sanctions brought against them through the World Trade Organization. the most important thing to recognize is that the evidence that intellectual property, and particularly patents, has blockaded, prevented, or otherwise hampered any response to the COVID-19 pandemic is zero. There is no evidence of any blockade by intellectual property, and particularly patents, of the medical response, and any response to the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, the evidence runs the exact opposite. Our ability to respond, as I mentioned, the mRNA platform technology was created through the knowledge base and the technologies that were invented and reinforced and made possible by the patent system. So the reason why that knowledge existed for them to invent those vaccines in 2 days and 2 hours, right, is because they had 20 years of private investments made, investments based on their patents and other intellectual property, that they then were able to develop the technological base. They were able to enter into licensing and information sharing agreements with other companies on the basis of these property rights to create a foundation of knowledge and technological capacity and an infrastructure, a commercial infrastructure that they could scale up for manufacturing. And so the response actually to the COVID-19 pandemic is unprecedented in human history. Unprecedented. We have never had a vaccine produced in 2 days, right? And you ask, well, why didn't we get the vaccine? But why didn't we get the vaccine in 2 days? Well, because of the FDA. They had to run their testing and their efficacy testing on it and things of this sort. But you realize the FDA had in its hands the BioNTech vaccine and the Moderna vaccine in February of 2020. It existed at that time. And the rest of the delay was testing at the FDA and also working, and there was some, they had to produce and get the manufacturing capacity up and running. The total number of vaccine doses that will be produced by the end of 2021, I've talked to people in the industry about this, is 12 billion doses, right? There's only, I think, 7.5 billion people on the entire planet, right? So what they call about, the equity of vaccine distribution to the developing world has nothing to do with patents. It's about distribution capacities in those countries. Those countries don't have infrastructure to distribute vaccines. Those countries don't have the capability. Many of those countries refuse to actually accept the vaccine. So the Pfizer CEO said he personally called world leaders in developing countries and said, we will give you our vaccine. We'll send it to you. And they said, this is a new technology and it's not tested and we don't want it. Right? So, we can't fault the Pfizer for countries leaders saying, we're not going to let you sell your vaccine in our country. So it's total injustice to the biopharmaceutical industry that they are being condemned, and they are by the Biden administration and by other officials for a pandemic for which they are the source of why we are able to be in this room and why millions of people around the globe are alive today, and that the COVID-19 pandemic will not be a repeat of the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, which killed an estimated 50 million people around the globe at a time when the world population was 15% what it is today. I mean, it's horrible how many people have died, but it will not rise to that level of what happened in 1918. And so we need to reaffirm to our innovators, you create these technologies over decades, like the mRNA platform, you will be secure in that. You will have the fruits of your inventive and productive labors secured to you. But then we need to reaffirm to the biopharmaceutical industry generally that you can rely on these effective and reliable property rights, as innovators have for the past 200 years in this country, to then manufacture, deploy, and distribute and license these technologies in the marketplace to get them into the hands of the people who wish to use them and through the healthcare market. So it's a real problem, and it's a real concern, especially also very quickly. At the end of the day, it's also not about patents. It's about trade secrets. It's about coercing the disclosure of trade secrets, because that's actually what's really the key value in the mRNA platform. In fact, the Moderna CEO, when the Biden administration announced its support for the Ip Waiver, the Moderna CEO said, I'm not losing any sleep over this because the value, he literally said that, I'm not losing any sleep over this, because the value in this is the technical know-how, and we spend, untold numbers of hours training people how to create these vaccines. This is cutting-edge human technology. And so what they're really looking for is actually the coerced disclosure of trade secrets around the globe, coercing and turning over to countries like China and Russia and India this incredible, valuable knowledge that was created by these innovators at Moderna and BioNTech and at Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson. And once you disclose a trade secret, that's letting the cat out of the bag. There's no getting the trade secret back because it's no longer a secret. And anyone can then do anything with it that they want. And so this is a huge threat to our innovators, our innovation economy, and also even to our national security, because the mRNA platform is a platform technology. And you were talking about disclosing it to countries like China and Russia. And we all know that they'll use it just for peaceful purposes. Yes, right? All right, so I'm sorry for going on about this, but this is a really huge issue. It's really important that we reaffirm and let your representatives in government know that they should not, if the Biden administration continues to support the IP waiver at the WTO, because that's a foreign policy matter, so that's what they have authority over as the executive. If there's a push in Congress to implement it domestically, to coerce the disclosure of trade secrets and to coerce the transfer of patents, that your representatives should not implement that in the United States, and that they should defend the rights of innovators in the United States. Yeah.
Your closing words really drove home the point how our recognition of intellectual property rights are just essential. What would, if a foreign nation were to steal an intellectual property, what can or what should the American government do? That's a
great question. And it keys into a little bit of what I was just talking about with respect to the IP waiver at the World Trade Organization, the WTO. I'll just call it the WTO. So as I mentioned, intellectual property rights are enforced within each country under their own domestic laws. So England has their own patent system, Germany has its own patent system, France has its own patent system, the United States has its own patent system. And this is, by the way, one of the reasons why I said we were unique. We were the very first country that said we are going to treat patents as property rights, not as personal privileges granted from the government because we want to grant out economic monopolies or anything of that sort. No, these are property rights, just like a farmer has a property right in his or her own farm. And so how you then ensure that intellectual property rights are respected by other countries is an issue beyond the laws themselves. That involves treaties. That's why we have TRIPS, the trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights, which was entered into in 1995. I mean, part of the purpose of that treaty was to try to get an international enforcement mechanism in international law through the mechanism of trade sanctions as a way to force countries to recognize and respect intellectual property rights between and amongst countries. Because otherwise, there's nothing you really can do except what you do in international relations generally, which is basically say to them, respect the rights of our citizens, or we're going to have to send our military, right? So, and that's perfectly legitimate too, for a country to do. But I don't know if we would want to be going to war every time a patent is infringed in another country. So, but we do respect our rights in the United States. So almost all countries, or at least the countries in the developed world, prohibit importation of infringing products. So if, for instance, if a company is importing a product that infringes on a patent protected under the United States law, the moment it's imported, it comes in the United States. So the act of importation can be prohibited, and you can file a complaint at what's called the International Trade Commission, which is a special court that addresses these international trade disputes within the United States under U.S. law. And you can get what's called an exclusion order. So basically an injunction in order to stop the importation. And that's legitimate. That's one of the ways you can respect the rights of your domestic U.S. innovators. Do we want to take another question from online?
Yes, we have another question. It says, why do you think there's so much hatred in the culture against some of the great innovators, like Rockefeller and the so-called robber barons of the 19th century, and today Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, Mark Zuckerberg, and others?
Yeah, these are all really great questions. And I think, the source is the hatred of the good for some people. It's envy. These are great people doing great, incredible things. And for that reason, we should attack and condemn them. And this is one of the reasons why, I've always been a strong advocate for the moral defense of intellectual property. Most people defend intellectual property on economic grounds. They say, oh, well, it's efficient and it benefits people's society and it expands social welfare and grows our economy. And I say, that's all true, but at root, they have a moral right to the fruits of their labors, their productive, inventive labors. And that's what we should respect, because the moral is the practical. Of course, it leads to good things in society because the moral is the practical. But these are good people who we should respect and recognize. The biopharmaceutical industry, big pharma as it's attacked as, right, is an incredible source of human flourishing in our lives today that we have lost perspective, that most people have lost perspective on. I mean, antibiotics are less than 100 years old. And I mean, to drive this point home of how radical this innovation has been to our lives in just 80 years. So President Coolidge, his teenage son was playing tennis on the front lawn of the White House in 1924 and injured his toe. He got a blood infection and died in 7 days. The teenage son of the President of the United States died in 7 days after playing tennis on the White House lawn because they didn't have antibiotics. Antibiotics hadn't been discovered yet. And so he got a common blood infection that you get, that you barely need a prescription for now, for the antibiotic to treat it. And so it's just, I mean, and that was 1924. It's less than 100 years ago. And so, think of diabetes, hepatitis, cancer, conditions that were death sentences, literally death sentences 20 years ago are now manageable day-to-day conditions. And it's all because of the incredible innovations of the biopharmaceutical industry and the work that they do, and they are just reviled for it, attacked for it constantly. And so, we should be heralding them. And I'm constantly telling representatives from the industry and other policy people, we have the moral high ground. We should never cede that to the other side by saying, well, it just happens to work, so you should bear the costs of these patents as a way to get these inventions. It's like, no, these patents represent these achievements. And they make possible these achievements, not just in the act of invention, but creating the commercial infrastructure and industrial infrastructure necessary, as you showed through these examples that we talked about today historically, to actually get these inventions, innovations into the hands of the people who do benefit from it. So, it just reflects kind of a really unfortunate tendencies within our culture that are growing, unfortunately, to attack innovators and creators and people because they are good. Yeah, in person.
Do you have any ideas or thoughts about legal procedures by which we might give property rights to those who make discoveries, not just inventors, but also scientists who discover new laws of nature, to somehow make that into a property right, so we can have not just invention factories, but maybe one day discovery factories?
Well, you can get a patent on a discovery. In fact, the word used in the Constitution, in what's called the Patent and Copyright Clause, which is the clause in Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8 is the portion of the Constitution that delegates the powers to Congress to what it can do. So Congress can only do what's in that article. That's where it says it can create an army and a navy, right? I know. Originally, that's where it says it can create an army and navy. That's where it says Congress can create courts, because the only court that actually is created in the Constitution is the Supreme Court. That's where it says it can coin money and do all the other things that it does and regulate commerce. But it has the copyright and patent clause that says, and I'm working from memory here, I should know it, but to promote the progress of useful arts, the exclusive right in their respective discoveries and writings will be secured for limited times to inventors and authors. So it's what authorizes Congress to enact the copyright legislation and patent legislation. Notice the word there is discovery. So you can get a patent on discovery. In fact, antibiotics, right, is it's a natural living organism that's found, or later a molecule that's discovered and it's isolated, right? So the idea is that, well, as long as you've taken something and turned it into a human value, then it becomes property. Then it's no longer a natural fact or a law of nature. And that's what you can get the patent on. And historically, you have been able to do that up until 2014, when the Supreme Court ignored that word discoveries and said, no, you can't get patents on discoveries. And in fact, the case was involved the discovery of the genes that cause breast cancer. So, which was a result of billions of dollars of research and work in the 1990s to discover what are called the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes that directly correlate with breast cancer. And so, by the way, what they discovered was the BRCA1 and BRCA2 genes in the lab as used now in a medical context. That's what the patent covered. And the Supreme Court said, that's just the law of nature, that these genes cause cancer. You can't get a patent on that. And this change in the law in the United States has caused untold damage to the biopharmaceutical industry, because they don't get secure protection anymore in their research labors that cost billions of dollars. The average cost of sunk R&D expenditures behind a single pill that's approved, before they sell a single pill that's approved by the FDA for sale in the healthcare market, is on average $2.6 billion. So that's how much the company has spent before, and they haven't even seen a dime yet, or a penny of a sale. So this is incredible innovation. Yeah, and so historically, and the United States historically has protected this. This is, again, one of our features. We recognize, yeah, you discover something in nature, you figure out a use for it in human life, you turn it into a value. Then that's patentable. That's because it's no longer just a mere fact or a law of nature. That's a human value, and that's exactly what we want people to be producing. We were unique in this, again, in our willingness to do this, and this is why the biotech and pharmaceutical revolutions occurred here in the United States, and it's why now venture capital investments in the biopharmaceutical industry and in other areas that are patent-intensive sectors of the economy are flowing now to actually Europe and even to China, if you can believe it. Because there, they say, we will give you patents on these things, even where you won't in the United States. Yeah.
Thank you.
Online?
Do we have time for one more?
Yeah.
Okay, someone asked, how should consumers respond to patent violations? Because some companies have great products, but they're built on numerous patents and copyright infringements. Or they gave another example, Samsung's violation of Apple's patents.
Yes.
Should consumers abstain from these products?
Oh, that's a good question. So it's a really good question. So first of all, a lot of products are not built on patent infringement per se. So one often hears there's a lot of myths like, there's thousands of patent violations in every smartphone and everything. That's actually not true. There are thousands of patents that cover various components of a smartphone, and they came up with a commercial innovation to address that. It's called portfolio licensing. So a company has like 1,000 patents. They don't know all of them that cover the smartphone, but they know some do, and they know others. So they license the entire portfolio. They say, we're not going to require you to negotiate 1,000 different license agreements. Just pay a license fee for the whole portfolio. And this is why we have smartphones and all sorts of other products and technologies where you have lots of overlapping patent rights. So it's not true that you actually have mass deliberate infringement. Also, Samsung was an interesting case because they actually did engage in the copying of various features of the iPhone, and it was proven in court, and they were liable, and they paid for it. And now they entered in. Now they have a license. And while a lawsuit is going on, right? The whole reason why there's a lawsuit is because there's a dispute between the parties. It can't be your job as the consumer who lack potentially the technical or legal knowledge that's being debated between the companies in the trial to be held accountable for that. So, I don't think you should refrain if there's current disputes. I mean, you should pay attention to it, and to the extent that a product is infringing. And to the extent that they're found liable, what results from that is not that the product is withdrawn from the market, because the companies want to make money. They ultimately enter into a license agreement. So then the company pays the money, and then there's an injunction that issues, and then they pay to have the injunction released by entering into a license agreement. And in fact, that was one of the interesting things that came out of the whole Apple versus Samsung lawsuit, was that one of the people didn't realize Apple was licensing its patents to all sorts of manufacturers. So while Steve Jobs is going around going, I'm going thermonuclear war, he literally said that on Google and Samsung for stealing my invention, they were licensing all sorts of people for making their own smartphones, and they had gone to Samsung. The reason why there was a lawsuit is they went to Samsung and said, you're using our technology, pay us a $30 phone license. And Samsung said, go pound sand. We're not paying. We're Samsung. I don't know if you know, but Samsung is a massive multi-conglomerate. They make cargo ships and everything. So what was Apple supposed to do? Apple had to sue, right? I mean, but you can't be as a consumer accountable for that. I mean, because that all came out during the discovery and then was disclosed in the trial. So you can't know these things, right? So the point, and there's also, as I said, a lot of myths and conventional wisdom about how patents function in the high-tech industry and markets more generally. I see cut off, but I refuse to cut off. So I only recognize intellectual property rights, not real-world property rights. No, but thank you.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and ring the bell to never miss a video.